Lawrence, your latest book is called The Known Unknowns, The
Mhm.
Unsolved Mysteries of the Cosmos. I mean, beautiful title. And I think it's perfect because this podcast represents one of those unsolved mysteries, the mind body problem, or what is consciousness. So I think let's
Yeah,
start with that problem. I mean, do you
hardest.
think there is a mind body problem, Lawrence? Or what is consciousness to
Well,
you?
I don't know if there's a problem. Uh, there's a pro. I think people make up a problem, suggesting the mind and the body are somehow different, which is clearly wrong, since the mind is made up of parts of the body, and it's nothing more and nothing less. But it's the most complicated thing you could imagine, which is why I don't study it as a field, because it's too complicated. Physics is so much easier, as I like to say. Um, But what is consciousness is a really good question. It's a question I tried to address in the chapter. As you know, the last chapter of my book is about consciousness, a subject that I studiously avoided in a sense because it's complicated. And I was suspicious about many of the books that claimed that they were understood consciousness or explained consciousness or any of those things. My friends of mine who relate those books to me all the time. And so I read, but I have a bunch of colleagues who are involved in this too. So I talked to them, and what I learned was, in fact, it's not only just as complicated as I thought, but more complicated. And we don't understand consciousness, and it's not even clear if consciousness is the right question
Mm.
to understand. I recently had a discussion with Noam Chomsky, who basically said it might be a red herring in the sense of trying to understand the mechanisms behind what we call self-awareness and I mean, he thinks there may, in the end, just be some kind of mathematical representation, and we won't even ask the questions that, how does this arise? But consciousness, obviously, it's like pornography. As that American judge said, I know it when I see it. Can't explain it, but I know it when I see it. And uh, we all understand our self-awareness, but what is quite clear is that it's just the tip of an iceberg. That what we're seeing, this narrative that each of us has with an idea of ourself, some person inside of our head, is clearly at some level an illusion. But but saying it's an illusion is really irrelevant. The whole world is an illusion in a sense. This table is hard, but it's an illusion in the sense that most of it's empty space, but it's hard. And time is, some people, as I say in my book, some people, the time's an illusion. Well, that may be true, but it doesn't help you when you miss the train to get to work. Uh, and so the question is, how does that illusion rise? That's the real question about science, and the why or whatever, or and even definitions are secondary. How does a biological system with complex sensory apparatus and homeostatic regulation of its internal states and feedback not only result in behavior, which all systems do, all living systems have behavior, but something that at least gives a sense of self-awareness and the illusion of choice.
Mm. When I spoke
Anyway, so the bottom line is that it is. I think it's telling that many of the researchers on consciousness don't bother to try and define it
yeah,
because it's so hard.
I
If
think
they can't, I'm not sure I can.
when I spoke to Noam Chomsky, we had a couple conversations about this, and I remember him saying, I mean, we know what matter is. We know what consciousness is. We just don't know what matter is. What are your thoughts when he says something like that? Because that opens up the door to many different types of theories of consciousness and reality. How would you define reality?
Oh my God. Um, Reality is that which continues to exist even when you stop believing in it. Like, that's a line from a famous science fiction writer that I really like.
Mm.
Um, and it's important. I think it's really important. I do think I do think there's an objective reality.
Mm.
We experience it in many different ways, but it exists independent of our own existence,
Mhm.
and it's independent of what we like or don't like. Um, of course, it's experienced in different ways, and no one can experience reality at all its levels, as far as we know.
Mm.
Science doesn't explore reality at all its levels yet either, which it's contingent. We don't have our physical theories all apply to a certain domain of reality, but not to all domains, unless we have someday a theory of everything, which I'm not convinced we'll have. then all of our theories apply over a limited domain of applicability, and they describe the world perfectly over that domain, as far as we can tell, and allow us to make predictions with untold accuracy. But they're not complete descriptions of reality. They're partial descriptions, and that's fine. Science accepts that. In fact, in physics, we even have a well-defined mathematical procedure for describing just how our picture of reality changes with scale or time.
Mm. When I spoke to Norm, he also mentioned the fact that, I mean, when people talk about the free will debate, you mentioned choice when you answered the question of consciousness. Yeah. What are your thoughts on free will? He says, I mean, it's like you should have common sense. Nobody walks around the place assuming they don't have free will. So the fact of the matter is, whether you're an illusionist about free will or not, you still are technically someone who believes in free will. Do you agree with that sentiment?
Well, I don't believe in anything. I don't think believe is a word that scientists should use. Things are likely or not likely. We act as if we have free will, and we might as well act as if we have free will. Mm-hmm. We're hardwired to act as if we have free will, I think, by evolution. And I, there is no, it's a fundamental level. There's no such thing as free will, but and that may affect. And I just recorded a very long podcast with Robert Sapolsky about this. His new book's coming out on that subject. And that may have implications for, or will have implications for punishment and stuff. But I think we have to act as if we'll take responsibility for our actions, and we try and think rationally. And our rational thinking, of course, is subject to a history of our own history. But we are partially rational beings, and we can assess the situation and try and act rationally. That itself is determined, but we can do that, and we might as well do that. And so, I think I really like Sapolsky's book because it's about neural processes a lot. I think, and his efforts over the years, I think primarily to overcome this notion of punishment. When I first read it, I thought, well, it's a good book. Most books on free will, I just say, it's worth one sentence. There's no such thing as free will, but for all intents and purposes, we live in a world which is appears indistinguishable from free will. So you might as well act as if you have it. But societally, we should recognize that it doesn't exist, and therefore, when we try and deal with how to make society function optimally, then we have to take that into account, especially in terms of punishment and jailing and criminality and that sort of thing.
I think it's very fascinating, particularly when we're talking about morality and how free will can impact morality and moral perspectives. Because another thing that seems to be very linked with morality is people's beliefs and religious beliefs. And over the years, I've been following your work for so many years, and at this point, I consider myself someone who's read all your books, been part of this journey. And I know there was a time where, well, maybe not all the books, but I think on my bookshelf, there's a whole section, and I don't really put them according to author, but I've got you, Dawkins, Dennett. There's a whole bunch of atheist books all in one section. You feel that over time, the New Age atheist movement that once was quite big has somehow changed or shifted in a way, or what do you think's happened to that?
My books aren't atheist books. My books are about science.
Yeah.
And in a sense, that's one and the same thing. But it's to get people excited about the real world and asking questions about the real world. Mm-hmm. Part of that is not, is overcoming false narratives and false beliefs in fairies and other things. There's a movement. I never like to be. I don't consider myself part of a movement, but there is, and like all movements, it's now like in many ways, it's just like in Life of Brian. It's splinters, and there's the People's Front for the Judean Liberation Front, and there's the Judean People's Liberation Front, and they all hate each other, and they argue, and so that happens to some extent, and I really think that the problem is that people treat it religiously as if atheism is just it's just not believing things without evidence, and so it's not something separate that you try and promote or promulgate, except getting people to question things and think freely and rationally. And to the extent that people try to make it more, it's kind of many people are atheists but have a great deal of secular religiosity. I was in a debate at the Oxford Union online, and the question was, is everyone religious? Or the proposition was everyone is religious. And I chose to be on the side saying yes, everyone's religious. And what I meant by that is if people weren't religious, we wouldn't need science. Because science trains us to overcome that natural predisposition to want to believe, to think we're significant, all of those things. And what you see is that often in this secular movement, it's replaced by ideologies like, social justice or woke, fundamentalist wokeism. And so you see that people want to believe and want to have ideas that can't be questioned, for which it's heretical to even have debate about all of the things that we've been fighting for, that we've been promoting with the Age of Enlightenment, that go out the window with these supposedly progressive groups.
I think I agree. Sorry, continue.
The right is, it's not to suggest that the whole problem is the left, because the right is just as desirous of suppressing free speech as the left appears to be, sometimes more.
I agree with because I remember when I was following it and I was reading your books, it came from a purely scientific background. It was me just reading these books, enjoying the science. And it just so happens that I am also an atheist who is enjoying the fact that you are as well. It wasn't necessarily...
Yeah, well, The Universe from Nothing was, Richard Dawkins wrote the foreword for it, or the afterword. Christopher Hitchens was writing the foreword when he died. But, that's in some sense an atheist book, because it tries... Darwin showed us that you don't need God to understand the diversity of life on Earth, and then instead of the next refuge of scoundrels, religious scoundrels as well. Okay, but you can't get a universe for nothing. And so, and Richard said that very kindly in the afterword, more or less, that it was a successor in that sense. I don't think of it as a same level in any way as Darwin's work, but it does try and address that slippery notion of, okay, well, we now understand life, you don't need some supernatural shenanigans, but surely you need supernatural shenanigans for a universe. And the point is, you don't. Now, does that mean there weren't? Well, no, but you don't need them, so
And tell me, what inspired the Unbelievers? Because that's such a cool concept for you guys to go on. It's almost like rock stars, just intellectual rock stars.
Well, that's what inspired it. I actually, the director and his brother, cinematographer, two young men who I've worked with a number of times, and I'm producing a new movie they're making. They were fans. They had first met me after some big event and came up and fanboyed, and later on they were making a movie and asked if I would do a cameo, a fiction movie, a science fiction movie called Intersect. Came out 7 years later, and I did that. But when we were filming, I was so impressed with the quality of their production that I actually had them then film many of my events and Origins events that we did, and actually they helped me create the Origins podcast initially. But there one day, it literally was one day, I was about to go a tour of Australia in a month or something, and Gus Alberta said, I'd love to do a rock and roll tour film about science. I forgot the way you put it, something like that. Where you've seen all these movies of rock tours, and he felt when he's seen me, that's what he thought when he'd seen me or Richard, that it was like a rock concert, and he thought it'd be really fun to follow us around. And I managed to reach out to some people and raise enough money it was amazing. 3 weeks later, a film crew of 5 people were following us in Australia and beginning to follow us around the world in various places. And it was a lot of fun. And I think I'm biased, but I think they did a great job. But the idea was more to sense the sense of this community, of the response, the desire to respond to the message we're sending, which is to not follow us, but to think freely. And the impact is great. It changed my whole perspective. I used to fight against religious fundamentalism. I still do, and secular religious fundamentalism. But what I realized, I got so many letters from people who said, this movie makes you realize I'm not alone. I live in a small town in the South of the United States, and I ask questions, and I realize if I bring up those questions, that people will think I'm a bad person. I have no one to talk to, and they think of themselves as bad people for saying, "Well, is there a God?" And so now, the sense that they realize they're not bad people, and there's a lot of people who think like that. That's really been useful. So I think I really am glad that movie got made.
Yeah, I mean, I as a kid, well, I consider myself a kid from Cape Town, South Africa, someone who grew up here in South Africa, and watching you guys, I mean, it's true. You look for this community, you look for people who sort of think alike, and it's sometimes tough to find. And then you see these people who write such eloquent books about this, and then you think, okay, this is exactly what I'm trying to say, except you guys are saying it for us.
Well, it's, maybe. I mean, yeah. Well, I mean, if that's useful, that's good too. I mean, some of my books are right. We're hoping that people will be able to utilize them to address conversations with other people. And hopefully it was also an entertaining movie too that way. But it is amazing. It's really amazing that people respond. I think the movie ends with the Reason Rally in Washington. There were, I don't know how many thousand people, but there were lots of people, and it was it was unbelievable. And these people, the reason they were so excited is that they really had not been in a environment where they felt that sense of community. And that's what religion does, by the way. It gives people a sense of community, and many people say, well, atheism, when you lose your faith, you lose a sense of community. Well, you don't lose anything when you lose your faith. You gain stuff. But many people have said, we should have the sense of community. But what worries me is I don't want to replace churches with atheist churches. Okay. I mean, atheism is, once again, it's just an attitude, and it's not a political belief. It's not an ideology. And it can and should allow discussion with all. I mean, it should subsume political beliefs and all the rest instead of implying certain things. And I will say that many people who decry intelligent design know almost, and make fun of religious people who speak about intelligent design equally have never really seriously thought about evolution. So, I mean, it's all right to use the buzzwords, and I'm fine that I'd rather people accept at some level, look, we can't be experts in everything, but when you look at something, you say, well, who might be most knowledgeable about human evolution? Maybe it's biologists. Okay, if they say this, well, I'm not going to study it exactly, but I'm willing to assume that they are probably a good starting point, because we don't have time to question and investigate everything that everyone says.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And your book is called, I know in America, I think you had to change the title of The Known Unknowns. I think it's called The Edge of Knowledge, right?
Yeah, it's called The Edge of Knowledge in the United States. Yes, and it's called The Known Unknowns in the UK. And
how do you feel about that? Because I know I've heard you speak about it. Well, how do you feel about the fact that you had to change that title? I mean, is that something that really?
Well, I didn't have to. My publisher in the US thought that The Known Unknowns would be polarizing because the quote comes from Donald Rumsfeld. Now, I say this, my publisher is a conservative publisher, a conservative religious publisher, in fact. So it wasn't as if them liberal bias. They just thought it would immediately polarize. Actually, I don't mind immediately. Well, I like provoking. I would prefer to provoke than polarize. So they said we'd prefer another title, and I came up. At the end of the book, I used the idea of the edge of knowledge, and so it's confusing because people think it's two books.
Yeah,
and maybe that's good. Maybe people buy both, but I do like The Known Unknowns, which was the original title. But I do like The Edge of Knowledge. It captures what I'm trying to talk about as well. So I don't feel I had to compromise in that sense. I understood my publisher's point, and my editors and publishers come up with titles. The authors usually have very little say.
Do you think that there are not enough scientists who have that poetic tact of approaching writing these books in a way that we can read it, or people who are not religious can read it in that almost religious sense, but not too much to sort of become a religion? Is there like a
I don't know. I hope to inspire people to think and I obviously I know I have an impact. People write me, so it works at some level, and I can't assess my own writing objectively. But People seem to like it.
Yeah.
And I do what I can do. I have a friend. Well, I have a very significant friend who tells me that all the time, who's suffered a lot for what he's done, but or for what he hasn't done actually. And so I put out there what I write my books like I do for my science for myself. All right, I do it because I need to do it, and I enjoy it, and I hope it is useful. But once I've written it, it's beyond my control.
When
I try and think about. I will say, unlike many scientists, perhaps because I spent a lot of time with the public from the time I was young, I try and think what kind of discussions, what kind of explanations might resonate. But that's a property of just being a teacher, in my opinion. You have to go to where your students are instead of assuming they're interested in what you have to say.
growing up,
I often tell teachers that's the biggest mistake they make.
growing up, did you ever feel that? Did you ever expect to be someone who's so at the forefront of the sort of scientific thinking and non-religious beliefs? And I mean, you're considered one of those people. You're considered anti-theist by almost everybody who sort of knows you. Did you ever think this would happen?
Well, no, yes and no. But I mean, what did I aspire to? I don't know. I mean, I admire the people who do the kind of things I do now and impacted my life. The scientists, writers and people who searched and discovered things. And so, yeah, I wanted to be like them, but I didn't have this trajectory, this clear trajectory. I mean, I have my friend saying Neil deGrasse Tyson had a clear trajectory, exactly what he wanted to do, and nothing got in the way.
Yes.
And I just planted seeds. So I need to write at some level, but I mean, my son, I hoped, I guess at some level when I was younger, I hoped that I would be in the position I admired, of those that I admired who encouraged me to do what I do. And a number of times in my life, I found myself in that position, and it's kind of humbling and scary, but also satisfying if you think about it correctly. But once again, I don't think I had that. I do what I do, and where it ends up and how I end up is beyond my control. But yeah, I'm sure I wanted to. I'm sure I liked the idea of being thought of as in the same vein of some of the people who I admired when I was younger, and I won't mention names because that suggests I put myself in the same vein, and I'm not going to suggest that. You can, other people can. I don't care.
I know someone who you really love is Galileo, and the way he wrote his writing style. I mean,
let's make one thing clear: Lawrence Krauss is no Galileo. But anyway, go on.
I know because
I do like, but I do like the fact that Galileo was not only invented modern science. Actually, his father was the father of modern science. But anyway, you read about how his father taught him what to do. You realize why he grew up the way he was. But his books, when we somehow teachers would never think of requiring students to read the two new sciences. But as I point out, they don't think twice about having students read James Joyce's Ulysses, and I think the former is easier than the latter, and funny. And so, I mean, he's sarcastic, he's witty. It's worth seeing. And I tell people, I like science writers. Don't get me wrong, and science journalists do an important job. But I tell people if they're going to read books about science, they should read ones written by scientists because it gives you a flavor of the kind of thinking that scientists do, and it's kind of important. And I think that's the dialogue, well, I'll call it the dialogue
he's very sharp.
Place in his dialogues. What's the word that Marx used to use for two competing ideas? Anyway, I used to think it's gone to my mind right now. Anyway, that dialogue is a central part of science because science requires people to criticize, to be willing to criticize. Was that
almost dissociation, that dissociative type of thinking where you can
yeah, what's the Marxist term for that?
I think I can't read.
Anyway, it starts with a D. Anyway, my mind is gone. I'm sorry.
I think that's pretty apparent in your writing as well. I mean, overall, when you're looking at, you want to have that sort of wit, that ability to make the audience laugh, and sort of think deeper about the topic. But most of all, you want that sort of deep or inspiring feel of what most religious texts do, but from your own non-believing sort of perspective.
Well, I mean, look, by the way, I mean, I think humor is a central part. Well, humor is a central part of my life because it helps me get through the day. And I think, if you're writing about science, people are intimidated. And
Mm,
so one has to think about ways to try and reduce that intimidation. And sometimes connecting to culture, like the physics of Star Trek, one of my books is one way. But another way I think is humor because it brings down those barriers, you know, and and so I think that's essential. Well, I write the way I speak or think, at least anyway, and I think humor keeps me interested enough to write,
yeah.
much less read. So I guess that's another whole.
So
Anyway.
tomorrow I have an interview planned with Avi Loeb, and
Oh
I'm
yeah.
curious, I'm curious to know because when I put out the fact that I'm chatting to you and I asked for questions, people went berserk regarding UFOs. They were like, "Do not ask Lawrence about anything regarding UAPs." Because they really seem to not like your responses. So I'm curious to know what's your
Oh,
take on it now.
oh, I'm glad they don't like my responses. I'm not sure. I'm glad
It's
of
obviously
that. But
coming from those
look,
who
I wrote a whole book. One of
defend.
my books, Beyond Star Trek, so demonstrates, you know, I'm having a dialogue in New York City on December 1st. For a long 25, 30 years ago, I used to debate these UFOologists, and then I got tired of it because they were making a living huckstering this stuff.
Mm,
But look, it's just the best line comes from that of Richard Feynman, who said when it comes to sort of UFO and aliens, he thinks UFOs are much more likely due to the known irrationality of humans rather than the unknown
mm,
rationality of aliens. The
mm,
bottom line is, when you think of the laws of physics, the least likely. It's so weird when people see something up in the sky they don't understand. It's immediately aliens and flying saucers. It used to be fairies, and as Carl Sagan pointed out in the 200 years ago, but the least likely possibility of every possibility that could happen, the least likely is that it's aliens coming to visit us because the laws of physics make it so implausible as to be less likely than anything, less likely than certainly less likely than the magic bullet that killed John Kennedy or went through three people and bounced back. Anything you could think of, no matter how wild, is more likely. And then moreover, there's not a single piece of evidence. Evidence in a real sense, eyewitness testimony not being that, and photographs we all know are suspicious. Well, you have to be skeptical.
mhm.
And the bottom line is this notion of a conspiracy is so ridiculous. Anyone who knows anything about the government knows, look, the money you would make if you could just come up and say, here, look, here's this alien body I have that we stored, and here's come investigate it, or here's a tricorder from the 23rd century. The governments can't keep secrets, and especially when there's a lot of money involved, and so the ridiculousness of assuming that there's a vast network of secrecy that's somehow effectively hiding something where every single person involved has a huge personal interest in violating that secrecy. I
Mm,
mean, it's more implausible than the UFOs themselves.
mm. That is pretty true. When I spoke to Michael Shermer, he said, I mean, the null hypothesis is true until proven otherwise. I mean, you can't, I mean, he wants extraordinary evidence to back an extraordinary claim.
Well, it's an extraordinary claim. You certainly need extraordinary evidence. Null hypothesis. It's all too high. Sounds too philosophical for me. Bottom line is that you need evidence to begin to accept something. Especially in principle, you should be suspicious of and skeptical of everything that people say. Now, obviously, in real life, you can't be. But when scientists, that's the way it works.
Mm.
Okay. Um, and so if it is something weird and wild, and like whether it's a scientific paper or aliens, I generally assume it's wrong unless someone convinces me otherwise. And even then, it might still be wrong.
Mm. A lot of people think you have beef with philosophers, and I know you really don't, but there's just a part of science that I think you really prefer over philosophy.
Well, I prefer science because I prefer science, but I mean philosophy. and dialectic. That's the word I was thinking about. My whole mind is gone. Marxist dialectic. Yeah, I'm sorry. My mind. I was just half of my mind was thinking about something else, trying to get it. That's what science is based on. But look, philosophical questions are part of science. They're a starting point. Asking critical questions, and then science takes off from that by experimentation and testing and all the rest. So we're all doing philosophy. It's just when people get hung up on the philosophical questions themselves, rather than that, if they're divorced from science, then I have little patience. But I respect the need to do critical analyses, especially in new fields. But I also recognize that reason is the slave of passion, and I often recognize. I talked about it with Robert Sapolsky and some of my atheist colleagues who are also philosophers, say ridiculous things about free will, because you can convince yourself of anything if you want to rationalize it. I think the great thing about nature, the reason I like science, is that it's not talk, it's not rationalization, it's not just purely rational analysis. I mean, mathematics is in a well-defined sense, and the best parts of philosophy in my mind are mathematical philosophy, logic. But nature tells you when you're wrong. That's what's wonderful. And it's so easy for us to go down the wrong road, even with our kind of rational thinking, that we constantly have to keep turning to nature to tell us if we're on the wrong path. And usually we are.
I've been
it's the pompousness. It's the pompousness of, it's the hyperspace with anything. But when people say, well, you can't, when some philosophers saying, well, you really can't, do quantum mechanics or even try to understand unless you read the philosophical literature. That's nonsense, because no physicists who do it for the first approximation read the philosophical literature. That doesn't mean the philosophical literature isn't interesting or important for philosophers, but it doesn't impact on physicists, most of whom, as I've said in the past, can't spell philosophy.
Someone commented saying, science without philosophy is religion. What do you think about that?
Well, I don't know what you mean by science without philosophy. So it's a nice sentence, but what do you mean? Philosophy is critical analysis, critical questioning, and followed by rational analysis. And that's a part of science. So that's why science was called natural philosophy. So science without philosophy isn't science, in a sense. It's just that science is more than what you define as certainly professional philosophy. Okay.
I think,
and the key aspect of that is experiments, I think, and that taking our direction from experiments rather than from purely rational critical questioning and analysis.
I think another way to think about it is also like philosophy without science. I look back and I think, I love philosophy, but I think of someone like Daniel Dennett, and in a time where many philosophers really disregarded science. And when he came out with a lot of his work, it was really apparent that they were completely ignoring scientific data.
Yeah. That's one of the things I've enjoyed about Dan Dennett, although he also tends to do that lately. but because he's a philosopher. But yeah, the philosophers that I admire most are the ones who remain in great touch with what's going on with the science. And the bottom line is, and I said in the book, I think the one area where physics began with philosophy, but it's gone way past it. The questions of interest to physicists are not the questions of interest in philosophers, period, for the most part. We are, what's the nature of reality and, what is time? These maybe, but they're not what drive physicists. They're not the questions as framed by philosophers. Those aren't what drive physicists. But in the newest area of science, that's where you need philosophy to frame the questions. And that's why consciousness is the area where philosophers are contributing as much in many ways as neuroscientists and psychologists and neurobiologists, because the questions themselves are not well defined yet and not well framed. And so you have people like Dennett and other people and Patricia Churchland and other philosophers and Chomsky's both, I'd say, but philosophers who are deeply involved in asking questions about the mind, because we don't even know what the freaking heck the mind is.
I think there's clearly a problem, because a lot of people nowadays use quantum mechanics and physics to defend theories of mind that go beyond neuroscience.
Yeah, none of them understand what quantum mechanics is when they're using them. That's the problem.
With that being said,
I talked to Sapolsky about it. He talked to someone else, a colleague of mine who I don't particularly anyway, it doesn't matter. And he was trying hard, but I think he didn't understand. And he's the first person to say he doesn't understand the quantum mechanics. But people use it because it looks like it somehow changes the world, the deterministic world. It doesn't. But I mean, it changes what we mean by measurement. But look, no one, as Feynman said, no one understands quantum mechanics. That's why. But many people who use it, I'd say quantum mechanics is the most abused part of science. Many years ago, I was part of the panel on public affairs of the American Physical Society, and I tried to get them to come out with a statement about the abuse of quantum mechanics. People with the secret and all this nonsense that if you think about the world, you can change it. You think about the world, you can change it, but only if you do something. Just thinking it's not going to change anything. And I tried to get them to write a statement, but in the end they wouldn't because they're timid and now it's kind of a useless organization. Anyway.
Do you think that people's misinterpretation of quantum mechanics stems from our lack of truly understanding what reality is?
Well, look, our lack of understanding quantum mechanics is that we don't experience the quantum world. General relativity and special relativity are easy because they're generalizations of things we can picture, like curved surfaces, and they're harder. And four-dimensional space is not something we can picture, but we can understand the classical analogs pretty well. And even, special relativity as well. I mean, the kind of thought, the Gedanken experiments of Einstein. But the world is quantum mechanical at a fundamental level, but it's not the world we experience. So we can never have this really, truly intuitive understanding of it at a full level. We build, those of us who work with it build up that, and the experimentalists build that. We can test our ideas and we build up an understanding, but not a complete one, not an intuitive one, which is why Feynman said that about quantum mechanics and why he was interested in quantum computing, because he said it would maybe help him understand quantum mechanics. Because a quantum computer it doesn't think, but it uses quantum mechanics directly to calculate things, whereas physicists use sort of classical kludges to kind of calculate quantum mechanical processes. Quantum mechanical processes involve a huge number of things going on at the same time, interfering in a way that results in something. But classically, we have to in order to do that, we have to calculate all of those things that are going on and see what interferes. And computationally, it's difficult, and that's why quantum computers may allow us to do quantum mechanical calculations we could never do otherwise. So he was interested in quantum computers, not because he wanted to crack codes of banks or other things that people think quantum computers might one day do, although they won't. He was more interested in using it as a tool to understand quantum mechanics and to solve quantum mechanical problems that he couldn't solve.
On that note, do you think at some point we can create sort of artificial consciousness from computers and quantum computers in the future?
Who knows? I see no obstacle to it. I mean, there's nothing. We're a physical system, and we work, and we apparently have a consciousness, and so what I see no obstacle to. I don't know whether neural nets or quantum computers are the right direction, but I see no obstacle to ultimately. I mean, there are lots of challenges. The amount of years ago, I calculated that the amount of power needed to do anything like processing in your brain was like 10 terawatts if you used an electronic computer, and we use 10 watts or 20 watts. So you're talking a million times different there. There's clearly some difference in. Now that's been come down by a factor of 1,000 or 100,000 or a million, but it's still a big difference. So we have to learn how the brain does what it does, and that and maybe we'll find a better way to do it. So maybe I don't think it's either artificial or intelligent right now, but maybe we'll develop machines that can do it more effectively than we can, because our consciousness arose out of evolution, it's clear that it's probably clear that the challenge that resulted in a conscious, self-aware brain probably wasn't, resulted from other needs of organisms, and not to be able to solve quantum mechanics problems, for sure. And so it's come about by evolution, and evolution is great, but there may be more efficient ways to produce it otherwise.
A quote from Marvin Minsky comes to mind when he once says that the trick of creating artificial intelligence that can ask the question, am I conscious now, it's a problem because humans rarely ask that question. We're most of the time on autopilot. We barely know what's happening.
Yeah. No, and that's the, there's this big Turing questions that you wonder, but one thing is coming up. ChatGPT can do a great job of answering questions and mimicking things, but it's asking the questions that really is the sign of, I think, intelligence. And of course, then it's understanding what you mean when you ask the questions, which it's not clear whether such a machine would do, but there ultimately may be no way to tell the difference between that and what people do. Many people probably don't understand the meaning of questions they ask anyway. But it's asking the questions and not answering them. That's a sign of intelligence, which is why I think we have to change the way we teach in schools. And instead of compiling facts as if it's an evidence of intelligence, it's teaching people how to ask questions. And that's the voyage of discovery.
At this point in your life, what questions are you asking most, and what's really getting under your skin nowadays?
Well, lots of things are getting under my skin. That's why I write most often. What's happening in society, especially the part of society that the political part of society that I thought I related most to, is secular ideology, the free speech going out the window, heresy, unquestionable assumptions, all of that drives me nuts because that's an anathema to my whole being as a scientist. But there are tons of scientific questions that get under my skin. They've gotten under my skin for a long time. And then that dark energy, which I proposed 30 years ago, is still on. We don't understand it. And and is there more than one universe? And how can we discover the nature of dark matter? Those are questions, scientific questions I ask myself, and different things get under my skin, and then I usually write about it, whether or not I produce something that gets published. It just sort of gets it off my chest.
In terms of string theory and multiverses in general, I mean, have your thoughts changed over time? Or where's your views at the moment?
I hope so. If they didn't change over time, it'd be awful. Well, look, no, I mean, some fundamental things haven't. String theory still has not demonstrated it's a theory of the world in which we live. It's produced a lot more than I would have thought it might, mathematically and useful in other physical problems. But it's certainly never done what it claimed it would do. But it's morphed into something much more complex that led to kind of interesting questions, holography and duality. But yeah, no, I'm opposed to hype, and that's why I'm opposed to the hype about consciousness books. I was opposed to the hype of string theory as a theory of everything, because as a Nobel Prize winning colleague of mine once said, string theory is promising, and it's promising and promising and keeps promising, but it hasn't delivered yet.
Lawrence, anyway. if you had to be close, I mean, I know you're tight on time. If you had to give me like your brief summary of our universe in a nutshell, and our attempts at a theory of everything, how would you give the story to someone?
I think Stephen Hawking wrote a universe in a nutshell. You could read his book wouldn't be clear. We have a universe that's describable right now, as far as we can tell, at all scales by four forces. No evidence for any other, and it's amazing. Four simple forces, all of which have the same mathematical basis, and called gauge theories. And those four forces, we think, are probably tied together, but we don't know how. We know two of them get tied together, the weak and electromagnetic force, and many of us think that they probably are at a fundamental level maybe tied together. But what we do know is that two of the fundamental pillars of our modern understanding of the world, one is general relativity, which is theory of space and time, and the other, which is quantum mechanics, which underlies the microscopic behavior of the other forces in nature. Those two things are inconsistent, apparently, as far as we can tell. And something has to give. And the big question is what? And the big question is not such a big question. That's the other thing. The theory of everything is not a theory of very much. It's actually a theory of very little, in the sense that a reconciliation of quantum mechanics and gravity would be important in two areas: the beginning of the universe and the ultimate nature of black holes. But you don't need it for any of the other things you needed to describe the universe. And so they're fundamentally of interest, those of us who are interested in how the universe began and whether it can be more in one universe, and what happens inside a black hole. Those are fascinating questions, and people are fascinated by them. But that's what we need a theory of quantum gravity for. And it will change our perspective of the world. It might tell us there are more than 4 dimensions. And so it'll change that picture, but it won't change how you calculate a ball sliding down a plane, or the orbits of planets, or how oatmeal boils.
Lawrence, in any final words for the podcast listeners? I mean, first of all, sorry, before you say that, the Origins podcast, what inspired this, and what is the goal moving forward with the Origins podcast?
I'm glad you asked that. Well, what inspired it was, look, I've tried through my whole life to point out that science and culture are closely tied together, and that the ideas of science and that science and culture are tied together by all wanting to give us a new perspective of our place in the cosmos. But they also deal with the important questions facing the 21st century. And so what I've tried with the Origins podcast is to bring together science and culture in ways to talk about those issues that are important for all of us as we assess and try and stumble our way through the 21st century, and excite people, and at the same time excite people and inspire them to look and ask questions about the universe and appreciate the amazing universe in which we live. So I use our podcast and the fortunate fact that my Rolodex has been relatively broad, and so I can bring a lot of interesting people from a lot of different areas, including the most well-known scientists, but other people, directors, actors, writers. And so, but there's a common theme, which is to bring people closer to them, to have a discussion and a dialogue, not an interview, as people hate when they hate the fact that I express my views in the Origins podcast. But it's a dialogue between two people interested. It's like a living room conversation, and not an interview. And I don't apologize for that. I've tried more. One learns. So I tried to more carefully not interrupt when it's not necessary, which is in a scientific debate, it's lots of interruptions back and forth, because you don't want to wait for the whole thing to get done. You want to move on. But anyway, so yeah, it's been an amazing experience. It's exhausting for me because, and maybe it's exhausting for you, but I do my homework a lot like some people, I guess. So when I'm reading, when I'm having a dialogue, I try and understand what people have done. So that means refreshing myself by reading 6 or 7 of Chomsky's last books in anticipation, reading this mammoth tome on free will, which I wouldn't have read otherwise, except it's fascinating, for Sapolsky. So it requires a lot of reading and preparation, and I find that exhausting. But on the other hand, it's energizing because I wouldn't read it otherwise. Same reason when I write, there's a lot of things I wouldn't understand or attempt to understand the level that I do unless I write about them.
Who've been some of your favorite guests?
So once again, it's all for me. It's me. Yes, sir, go on.
Who've been some of your favorite guests on the podcast so far, and why?
Oh, I don't think in terms of favorites. Everyone asking what's your favorite of this then. I mean, there have been really fun ones that surprised people. One of the earliest ones with Ricky Gervais was fascinating because people didn't realize he asked. He's interested in science and asks great questions. And of course, Stephen Fry is lovely to listen to. I could just listen to him talk. I can read the phone book. Be fine. But Noam, my many dialogues with Noam. I like dialogues with people who also come from a different sort of political perspective as I, and who can teach me things also. Dialogues on areas like Sapolsky's. He's politically on my side, but I learned a lot of neurobiology. So, but Douglas Murray, who's certainly and even Jordan Peterson, with whom. We did one in his podcast and one on mine, and it was interesting. I think it was interesting. I disagree with a lot of what he says, but the fact that we can have a dialogue about key things and ask each other questions, I think was really useful.
Was Jordan able to define God for you?
No, but I don't. He has I try not to put on the spot, because if you ask Jordan to define anything, you will end up in an invariably long ramble. And sometimes I caught him. And the neat thing about Jordan, though, is sometimes when he rambles and you point out the logical contradiction or that's going somewhere, he'll say you're right. He realizes it. It doesn't stop him from doing it. But I appreciate that often he'll say, oh, okay, he'll express a viewpoint. He'll say, well, that's inconsistent because of X, Y, or Z. Oh, I guess it is. So I think I got to give him credit for that.
The
Even though, anyway.
sorry,
Sorry, what?
are there any guests that are forthcoming that you're really excited about?
I'm excited about all my guests. It's like and seriously, it's like people ask me, what's your favorite, most exciting book? Well, it's the one I just wrote because I'm excited about it. But I love the podcast with Sapolsky. I had a great ones coming up with Peter Singer, a philosopher.
Yes.
Who's impacted on my own life in many ways. I'm a vegetarian now, and not in small part because of Peter Singer. I have a fascinating experience with Scott Aronson, who's a computer scientist, talking about AI and computational complexity and that sort of thing. And I've got I've got some hopes. There's some people who I thought we'd be doing it, may not. I was hoping that it looked like I was going to have a podcast with Garrison Keillor, who you may not know if you're not American, and it was wonderful. But like most things, like the books I write or the scientific work I do, the most exciting stuff is the stuff I don't know is going to happen yet. So I can tell you that, as I say, Sapolsky, Singer, Aronson are ones that I'm excited about that are coming up, as well as another dialogue I did with Richard Dawkins. But
I think I have to ask you about Dawkins because you guys have done so much work together. What's it like going around the world with this guy and really expressing your thoughts and intuitions about the universe together? Completely different fields coming together. You think of physics and biology. What's that like?
Well, I like to think. Well, I always respected Richard, but I like to think his respect for me has increased over time. It's new insights. It's sharing a worldview, but we're very different people, and it's for me. It's fun to watch Richard's being very different than me, and I think it's a nice thing for people to see that difference in personality and character as well as feels. But we obviously complement each other, I think. And each time, what's fun is and we challenge. We just did something in Birmingham last week. The first time Richard ever interviewed me officially for his podcast, to do new things, to come up with new things, to not make it the same discussion. And what Richard's always been surprised about, and I haven't been as surprised, is at the end of it, he goes, "Wow, that was neat. That was maybe the best." Is that we can talk about new things. There's a lot to talk about. And I enjoy. I enjoy, and I'm honored by the camaraderie that we have.
Do you ever get afraid of falling into that trap where people often praise Richard of being this amazing evolutionary biologist, but really dislike the fact that he's gone down the atheist route? Do you ever feel, writing about it at least, that you might fall into?
Well, when I first interacted with Richard, it was that rad. Basically said, "Look, why are you doing this? Because you're just alienating people, and in some sense." And we had that in the Unbelievers. I think it almost begins the question. Are you trying to? What's your goal? Are you trying to get people to stop believing in God or understand the universe? And Richard fell more on the side of wanting to get people to stop believing in God because he views it as I do often, an impediment to that. Whereas my interest is really just getting people excited about the real universe without all the nonsense. So we come at it slightly differently. But I think it takes 1,000 points of light. And I think Richard inspires people with his approach that I don't. And maybe I inspire some people with my approach that Richard doesn't. So it takes all types.
Lawrence, it's such a pleasure to chat to you. Any final words from your side? Anything you want to be left unsaid? And by the way, do you have a question for Avi Loeb tomorrow? No.
I know Avi. No, I have no questions for Avi Loeb. I don't think there's anything right now worth questioning. At least with the stuff he's going to talk about. Yeah. Maybe other stuff, but all this alien stuff is much ado about nothing. Much ado about very little. But it's been good for him, so good.
Are you concerned at all about this rise in UAP talk?
What was that?
Are you concerned at all about this rise in UAP talk as of late?
That's it's been there before. It'll be here again. The only concern I have is it because it's amplified by the nonsense of the internet.
Mm.
There used to at least be a few people and shouting, and other people believing, maybe. Well, but now there's this, vocal and really kind of aggressive claims, and unfortunately, then institutions, respond, like, the government says, saying, well, when NASA came out with their analyses saying there's no evidence, but which is great, but they still kind of kowtow a little bit too much to saying, we're investigating all the stuff that's been done, and well, it's true, but the idea they're trying to virtue signal in their own way.
Yeah.
So I don't like virtue signaling. I've come to hate it.
Yes.
And I didn't even know what it was till Ian McEwan used the word once for me. I never heard it.
Yeah, it's almost like a government has to respond. I mean, if they do something about it,
of course they have to respond. They have to placate people at some level. You can't just say, but they did respond. NASA did respond, and I think, and it doesn't need to say anything else. But yeah, I guess the only thing is the viciousness and aggressiveness. But other than that, there'll always be nonsense. There'll always be. It's because everyone. We all are Fox Mulder. We all want to believe, and it's science that helps us get around the fact that we want to believe. And sometimes science tells us we know we want to believe, but sorry, it's not there. And so, first recognizing we want to believe is an important thing. And I don't like to play into that goal, but on the other hand, I do, in the sense that I'm trying to play into people's. One of the greatest ways to learn in science is to confront your own misconceptions. So bringing out those misconceptions in an exciting way allows you to try and confront them. And even the physics of Star Trek and things like that was confronting people's misconceptions.
I'm not sure if I've ever heard you talk about this, but outside of physics, what is your favorite scientific field? Outside of
physics,
your favorite field within science, except for physics?
I don't have favorites. I told you that it's apples and oranges. I don't think in favorites. Obviously, neuroscience is a fascinating area, but so is genetics. And I wish I knew more about it. I've learned a lot in my time. But when I was going to school, and my mother wanted me to be a doctor desperately, I dropped biology because when I was going to school in the that would have been in the early 60s, maybe. Biology was dissecting frogs and stuff. It wasn't interesting. I mean, DNA, the genetic code really had just been discovered, but it hadn't filtered its way down, at least in my experience, into high school. And it's now such a fascinating area that I wish I'd like to learn more about it. No, but I'm fascinated by it all. I don't think I have everything about the universe fascinates me. And as I like to say, every day I wake up and I'm surprised if I'm not surprised.
I like that. How could the average listener of this podcast be a true scientist?
Well, everyone is. Just channel your inner child. Ask questions. Be willing to change your mind when you're wrong. Test your ideas, and have fun. Ask questions that excite you, and try and explore. Try and boldly go where no one has gone before.
I often hate when someone asks me this, but when was the last time you changed your mind, Lawrence?
Well, I changed my mind earlier. I wasn't going to, I thought I was too busy to do this. And there you go.
And I appreciate that so much. I mean, it's been
I like to think I changed my mind. I do. The older I get, I think the more I realize that, well, it's easy to feel you know everything when you're younger.
I feel from watching you. I feel from listening.
I changed. I actually just gave a lecture in England about changing minds, about 3 examples of the way the scientific community changed minds. One involved me. I mean, when we first proposed the empty space and energy, it was, it was a crazy idea. I thought it was crazy before it appeared to be true. And then it is apparently, and it's crazy. So I've changed my mind, and I've helped in that sense change other people's mind. Not as much as the observers, who then won a Nobel Prize for what they did, but anyway, it's. I hope I change my mind again, and in fact, I will be happy to have another conversation with you. That's another maybe change in my mind.
Well, I'm so grateful for that. I mean, it's been such a pleasure and a privilege, and I look forward to your work throughout the future. And I mean, good luck. The podcast is absolutely amazing. I'm a fan of all the guests and yourself, and I appreciate all your work throughout the years.
Thanks. Well, Well, thank you. Well, this was lovely. I really enjoyed it. I really did. And keep up the good work yourself. And yeah, I'm sorry I have to rush off because of my travels, but
No,
we'll
no
talk
problem
again.
at all. Thank you so much,
Okay.
Lawrence. Take care. Right. Have
Take care.
a great flight, eh?
Thanks. Okay. Take care.
Yes.
Bye-bye.